Welcome to the Retiring Real Estate Investor Podcast, where we will discuss how to defer taxes on the sale of your property, earning passive real estate income, and everything you need to know to go from active investor to passive investor. Join us as we interview passive investment sponsors, explore the journey of other retiring real estate investors, and share our due diligence process we perform to select passive investments. Investment advisory services provided by Insight Investment Advisors, LLC, a registered investment advisor. This podcast is only intended for clients and interested investors residing in the states in which we are registered to provide investment advisory services or exempt from registration. Please contact us to determine if the firm provides investment advisory services in the state where you reside. All content on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice. Material presented is believed to be reliable sources, and no representations are made by our firm as to another party's informational accuracy or completeness. Insight Investment Advisors, LLC and its representatives do not provide tax or legal advice, and nothing herein should be construed as such. Always consult with your tax advisor or attorney regarding your specific circumstances. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Retiring Real Estate Investor Podcast. Excited that you're able to join us. I'm joined by Tim Little. Tim is the founder of Zana Investments, and you're in Florida, correct?
Yeah, I'm in beautiful but very hot Tampa right now.
Yeah, let's timestamp this a little bit. It is not December, and it probably is not cool by you guys, to say the least, right?
No, not at all. I think yesterday actual temperature was 96, but heat index was like 110, something like that.
What's worse, 110 heat index or covered in the Canadian fire cloud bloom? I don't know. I don't know the right answer there. That's what we're having going on in Wisconsin.
At least we could breathe. We may be sweating, but we can breathe.
I was going to tell you, I'll take the heat index. We are struggling here. Someday this will be gone. But so we time-stamped yourself. Tell our listeners, Tim, a little bit about what you're doing with Zana. You've been at that for, I believe, almost 4 years now, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So Zana Investments, it's named after my two daughters, Zara and Lana. And, really picked that name so that I could remember what my focus is and why I was doing it, which is basically to, create, wealth for me and my family, but at the same time, to bring that to other people as well. Like a lot of investors, I started out just trying to say, hey, how can I build money outside of my W-2 job? How can I create some kind of, retirement is what I was honestly looking at. I wasn't looking at, having a whole bunch of cash flow coming in now. I was trying to look way down the road. And so, my background is mainly military. Got off of active duty in 2008, stayed in the reserves. But after that, went to grad school, then did the corporate thing. And it was really then, once I had a job again after being a poor grad school student, that I was like, okay, now I'm actually going to get into real estate instead of just reading about it and learning about it. And what I did is first I started like most people do. All right, what can I afford to buy real estate wise? And living in Washington, D.C. at the time, which, as everybody knows, then and now, a very expensive area. Mm-hmm. And so I looked outside of the D.C. area and tried to look at those concentric circles to say, hey, what is close enough that I could go and visit, get eyes on, but is still affordable. And that's how I kind of landed on Richmond, Virginia. And so we made a whole weekend out of it. I had linked up with a realtor who kind of specialized in dealing with investors. And he set up property tours for 5 different properties in one weekend. And so we just went down there, stayed in Richmond, saw the whole area. It was great. He showed us around and we toured those 5 different properties and landed on a duplex. This duplex is like 100-year-old house where they basically just sealed up the stairwell and divided the top floor and the bottom floor into 2 different units, and managed to get that property for $85,000, which was amazing for a duplex, right? And I had specific criteria going in. My criteria, I think at the time, was at least $200 a month cash flow per unit when all was said and done. And that was inclusive of an assumed 10% going straight to property management, because I can't manage it from, a couple hours away. So bought that property, had the usual ups and downs that any, landlord has. I think within the first 2 months, tenant stopped paying because it was an inherited tenant. They hadn't been vetted properly. They just took off in the middle of the night one night because they decided they were never going to be able to pay and didn't want to deal with eviction, and left everything in the house. So then you're spending a couple of $1,000s to go ahead and get that stuff out, get it ready. And of course, challenges with property managers. And so all these little things were starting to add up, all these little annoyances in dealing with tenants and dealing with property managers who are, taking 10%, but doing maybe 2% worth of work. And that's when I started to look into how can I scale this? And everybody, when they're getting started on bigger pockets and stuff like this, they figure out what their freedom number is, right? Like, okay, if I'm making this much per unit, this is how many units I need to own in order to to replace my income, right? Because that's the dream. And I figured out it was something like 40 duplexes or something. I needed to own.
Not 5, 40.
Right. And just a quick note, I keep saying duplexes, and that was very intentional, right? A lot of people just do single family homes, but I went into it with the firm commitment of only having multifamily properties. And that was largely to mitigate risk, right? Because if you have a single family property, it's either 100% vacant or 100% occupied. There's no in between. And I did not want to be in that situation. Yeah. So that's why I went with duplexes straight off the bat. So I don't know if you want me to stop there before I move on, but
yep, I'm writing 6 questions down as you're going. That I want to double back on. This is a great intro. I want to double back on your experience a little bit. So like my good flags go up when I hear military background experience, because I think about discipline, I think about operational efficiency. Is that helping you today in the way that you approach managing the multifamily properties now? Has that been very influential experience for you in just picking those skills up and applying them right to multifamily?
Yeah, I think 2 things specifically. I would say managing, because as officers, that is our primary role, right? We're not necessarily experts in the individual jobs of our soldiers, but we need to understand their jobs so that we can best implement, their capabilities. Right? How can we use them best to get done what needs to get done? So I think the management side of things, it's definitely helped me, working with teams, delegating responsibilities, but then kind of making sure that things get done, which is super important when you get into, especially the syndication side of things, and your asset managing, because what you're really doing is managing the manager, right? You have a third party property manager whose job it is on the day-to-day to handle all the aspects of property management. But what you need to do is to hold them to account for whatever metrics that are tied to that, whether it's, occupancy, lease renewals, how few or how many, things need to be fixed around the property, how, the speed of the construction, if they're handling the construction, stuff like that. So that managing the manager piece, I think, has certainly been helped by my management and leadership experience within the military. And then the other piece I'd say is the problem solving aspect. I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize, especially on the officer side of the house, is one of our primary responsibilities is to, look at a problem, figure it out, and then think through, 2, 3, 5 solutions to that problem and pick the best one, then apply it. So problem solving is very important. And I think it's The military has made me much better at that process of problem solving, and that applies just as much in this industry as it does in any other.
Oh, that's perfect. Walk us through a little bit deeper on the transition you made from military to a little stop in corporate, I'll call it. And then what was that trigger that flipped you to real estate? If folks are watching on YouTube, right behind you is a couple books that might have sparked that interest a little bit. I see the infamous Rich Dad Poor Dad back there. What was that? Take us a little deeper into that process of going from military corp to, all right, it's time to do real estate.
Yeah, and I think the first time I read Rich Dad Poor Dad, I still was in the military, but there's this whole idea of like you have to be in the right place in your life before you can apply things that you learn sometimes.
Yep.
And the first time I read it, I was pretty early in my military career. I was in between back-to-back deployments, and so there wasn't the time nor focus available to apply what I was reading. But I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. And then I was like, oh, okay, I gotta go to Iraq. And it just gets thrown back on the shelf, right?
That's where Richmond right now got a little bit more important things going on.
Right. But then once I got into the corporate world and, had an MBA under my belt and read it again, those lessons in there really started to resonate a lot more. And I think I was in a much better place to apply them. So that's kind of where that transition happened. Like I said, when I was still working in corporate, where I was able to save money, to put towards those investments. Because again, when you're a college student, most of the time, you don't have a whole lot of, additional income to put towards investments and stuff like that. So that's where I found myself. And it started, like I said, with that duplex, but I found that there was a problem with scale there, and it was going to be very difficult to scale. So that's when I got introduced to the syndication side of things, first through some podcasts and some books, and then eventually going to a convention, I think out in Texas. And that's where I was just got the fire hose, and I was like, whoa, okay. And not everything made sense the first time around. And I think that's pretty natural. So if people get intimidated the first time they start learning about this stuff, especially the jargon, all the language that's used, it can be a bit confusing. But that's when I started to make myself smart on that. And I determined that I was going to get into a passive investment first to continue my education before doing anything else. And so, fast forward a little bit, I wound up, after I was done playing in corporate, I decided to hop back on orders because, as happens with a lot of military folks, I got bored. And so I was like, the best way to mix things up, get back in the uniform, and, where you never know what you're going to do each day. And so had the opportunity to come on orders here in Tampa, and they moved our family and everything else. So change of scenery, change of job. And that's a good way of refreshing things, right? And so was doing that for a little bit, but wound up getting deployed again for about 9 months, almost a year. And I was like, this is a perfect opportunity for me to do the passive investment. I had saved up just enough to get into a syndication, which to me seemed like a huge amount of money, like $25,000. I was just like, this is a huge leap of faith, right? Especially for something that wasn't a proven quantity yet. I was like, okay, let's see if this is real. And then sure enough, I asked a lot of questions, and the sponsor was very patient with me, despite some of those questions being, kind of stupid in retrospect. But that's what it's all about. It's about investor education. And luckily, and I would have said that's a red flag if they're not patient, with any potential investor. And so put my 25,000 into that first LP deal back in, this was 2017. And so while I was on that deployment, I got my first distribution check, and I was like, okay, this is real.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the turning point right there.
That's interesting. Did that full cycle, that first investment you're in yet? Just curious.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Awesome.
a couple of years ago.
Oh, awesome. What a scary thing sending that first wire out for 25 grand. You're like, yeah, and it's gone. Where'd it go?
Exactly.
I mean, you knew where it went, and it's producing and doing well for you, so it feels more tangible now. But it's a scary thing to send that first one out. It's interesting the route that you took on this to kind of taste test, and it's something that we do personally with our money for our investors and really for ourselves is, yeah, I want to sample what the full experience is like from a syndicator or from a passive or private investment, and really get a feel for it and to understand, how it's one thing to have the conversation and do your due diligence and homework. It's another thing to be year 3 into a deal with a syndicator and figure out what that feels like. It's something different. And so we like to do that where we can, not a prerequisite requirement, but definitely gives us a better sense and feel for it. So it was also interesting, not taking our piece out of there, that you said with Rich Dad Poor Dad, and just generally in accepting some of the information that you're given. I could dump all the right information in the world on top of somebody. If they're not ready to hear it, they're not going to hear it. And it's such an interesting thing that you're kind of pulling that out a little bit. You weren't necessarily ready, but that book probably hit you differently a few years later than it did the first time that you read it. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely accurate. And I think we see the same thing a lot of times with like my own passive investors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they may be following me for a couple of years, having heard my podcast or heard me on like your podcast or seen me on LinkedIn, and just getting little nuggets here and there, and starting to understand little by little the concepts applied, and maybe they're building up their own little nest egg as things go along, or maybe they're ready to 2 years down the road, ready to liquidate some properties that they have and go into something more passive. And that's when they call me up and say, hey Tim, yeah, I've been listening to you for years now. And I'm like, oh, well, like what? It's weird to me to think that people are just out there, not like creeping, but like listening, but without engaging, because they're taking it in. And exactly like you said, at that moment they may not have been at the right place where they can apply the services or the lessons that you have, but one day they do get there.
Yeah, we were talking about it a little bit before we hit record of the sort of social presence and proof. I think they call them lurkers on LinkedIn. I don't know if I like that terminology either.
Not flattering, but
no, not flattering either. We got to come up with something better to call folks. They're just exploring a little bit. I mean, I do the same thing, not in our industry. I do the same thing with, before we hopped on, I was watching, this is a rabbit hole to not go down, warning, YouTube golf videos. Very scary place to be very cautious. But there are a few that I found that make a lot of sense, and they have no idea that I'm watching. How would they? No clue, right? So I kind of take that perspective back to the social proof we're putting out there and you're putting out there, and that there's probably lots of folks just like us that are consuming, sitting. Maybe there's some call to action, maybe there isn't. But at some point, maybe we're going to engage, and you just don't quite know when that is. But it is up to me to sort of decide that as a consumer, and up to our customers to sort of decide when they want to poke in and stop lurking at some point. So I kind of get it a little bit. It is vastly interesting though, when we do hear from some of these folks. So talk to me a little bit about what's going on today. How many units under management? How many clients? Where things stand today with Zana?
Yeah, and so right now we're at about 60 million assets under management, about 527 units. Those numbers are obviously always in flux, because we have one that we just closed on, but we're not allowed to put anything official out there in terms of where and what it is. But it's increased quite quickly, and I know people talk about Michael Blank's like law of the first deal, like and that's not really some magical thing.
Mhm.
It's more about once you get into that um once you get into that group and around those people and they see that you're doing deals
Mhm.
and they learn to trust you, well,
Mhm.
then you start to find the people that you like to work with and they say, hey, Tim, we got this deal going on. You want to come in on this?
Mhm.
Because you're a known quantity at that point.
Mhm.
They see what you've done on another deal. you know, um, the people that you've worked with, if people vouch for you, then it kind of starts to roll along. Now,
Mhm.
right now, deals are getting a little harder to pencil out within multifamily
Yeah.
specifically. And so what we're doing a lot more of right now is partnering with other co-GPs in order
Mhm.
to get deals done, helping out with the raise, boots on ground,
Mhm.
whatever aspects that they need within that partnership so that we can work together to get the deal done. But ultimately, we're still trying to find a deal that works for us
Mhm.
where we could be 100% in control and then bring others into the fold with us. Um, and kind of return the favor to maybe some of those smaller sponsors
Mhm.
who are looking for their first win, just like people took that chance on us.
Interesting. Is there a geographic focus historically that you've looked at? And then is that changing as we move? Because I've been ranting relatively frequently and often about how tough this is right now in the multifamily space to find things that pencil. And then even worse, I've been ranting about how some deals I've seen get done have cap numbers on them that make me scared. Is that changing the way that you look at some of your geographic focus?
Um, I because it seems hard everywhere. I don't know if it's changing the geographic focus.
Hmm.
We are primarily focused on Florida, Texas, and Georgia.
Hmm.
Those are where all our properties are located. We
Yeah.
really like Atlanta. So I think the more we could do there, the better. You get the advantage of, having expertise within a region.
Hmm.
One of our partners is also boots on ground in Atlanta. So we have that advantage of being able to visit the properties on a regular basis. Whereas, the further you get away, then you're talking about flights to go to the property and
Hmm.
you're relying more on whoever, your partner GP who happens to be boots on the ground over there. So that's what we're looking for now. I'd certainly be open to things in Florida, but
Hmm.
like with Tampa, for example, it got really frothy around the time of COVID, but even still, it's still up there. It hasn't quite the bubbling
Yeah.
hasn't come down yet, and so the cost per unit is just seems out of control.
Hmm.
And what we're seeing is that despite the conditions changing, sellers just are not willing to accept the reality as it is. And
Hmm.
it puts brokers in a weird place too,
Yeah.
because they're like, hey, we know this isn't the same as it was, 6 months, 12 months ago, but
Mhm.
the guy wants this much. So and it's like, okay, well, we are at a standstill then,
Exactly. What do you think that it's a hard question for me to ask. What do you think from a seller perspective? How does that mindset need to change? I mean, is that a percentage basis? Do these numbers really need to come down 20+% when I just think about and a very generalistic statement when I just think about how rates have risen? Is that is that a starting point that sellers need to think about if they actually want to sell?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have to accept the reality of the buyer. If the buyer's situation has changed, you can't ignore that as a consideration. And it certainly has changed based on the rates that are available right now. I mean, there's a huge difference between 4 and 5%, on a mortgage and 6 to 7, right?
Mhm.
Like there there is a material difference in how much someone can pay based on those rates and the leverage that they're able to get.
Mhm.
Instead of 80 to 85%, they're only able to get 65.
Mhm.
Well, okay, then that means they're having to come to the table with a lot more money. You have to take that into account. I don't see how you don't and still expect to sell.
Feels like folks may not expect to sell.
Yeah.
As we stare at each other from across the table. Yeah, I mean it's a very tough environment. Yeah, what is a broker supposed to do? They can't necessarily force the seller to take a discount. Talk a little bit about some of the asset class you're focusing on. Is it A class, or are you looking at B and C and to do some value add there?
Yeah. And so we've done exclusively B and C.
Mhm.
It's not that we're, opposed to A, but there's just other challenges when it comes to A. Then you're competing against institutional buyers.
Mhm.
There's usually also less cash flow available for investors once you get into that space. So we primarily looked at B and C. Admittedly, C, we're trying to get away from it,
Mm.
just because then you have more issues on the tenant side.
Mhm.
And there's usually more of a capex lift when you get into the C minus, and so we don't want to have to do as much turnaround
Mhm.
on properties. So we're trying to find those Bs that there's still some value add there, some rehab that needs to be done, just renovate it up to current standards so that we
Gotcha.
can get current rents. And you asked about whether it's the regional that's changing.
Mhm.
It's not so much the regional, but one thing that we have been looking for, which I'm sure we're not the only one,
Mm.
is loan assumptions, right? Because
Oh,
that's one way that deals are happening nowadays, despite the rates being
Mhm.
so high. So I'll give you an example. The property that we're closing on is a loan assumption, and it's like a 3.5% fixed rate,
Yeah.
right? Which is crazy.
Mhm.
And I think it has like almost 2 years of interest only. That's impossible to find or to get. But if you can find someone who's willing to sell and has that loan assumption, and you can qualify for that loan assumption,
Yeah.
then that's one way where deals are working.
I like to say that Jerome Powell changed the game that we're playing and picked up the Monopoly board and gave us another one. When you take a loan assumption, you can kind of go back to that other board that Jerome put in the corner and say, "Wait a second, no, I can still play this. I can put my game pieces on this board still, and take on some of the loan assumption pieces." Yeah, it's a huge thing. It's almost like a golden ticket at this point if you
Yeah,
can find it.
right.
It's phenomenal. Um, talk about the team a little bit. Actually, let's talk about. You've mentioned this a couple times when you mentioned the duplex and the property managers, and then your role in sort of managing those property managers. I think there's this incorrect assumption out there that if I'm an active manager, the moment I go and get a property manager, I've all of a sudden it's become passive for me. I think you blew that up twice. You want to blow a massive hole in that assumption that having a property manager does not mean it's passive.
No, because things can go very wrong if you're too hands off with your property manager. I mean, you just have to think about it from a perspective of like expenses, just as one example, right? Um, they're spending money on your behalf on everything from repairs to the golf cart that rides around the property to see if things are done, to um, wages, right? And so you have to look at that and make sure that everything is within line of what you talked about. Do they have the number of people on the property that you determined you would need according to your business plan? Whether
Mhm.
that's one maintenance tech and one leasing agent, or maybe you need two leasing agents because you're in the lease up phase, but you only need the one maintenance guy. And maybe it's the other way around. But the point is, you need to be evaluating these things throughout to see if that balance is always there. Especially, if you're in Texas in summertime and HVAC is such a huge issue, because if someone's HVAC goes out when it's 115, well, that's an issue. Like that's a health and safety issue. And
Mhm.
so, maybe you need additional coverage, from the maintenance side of things there. Maybe you need to up the budget for
Mhm.
HVAC repair and supplies. You need to be looking at all of these line items on a regular basis to make sure that they stay under control. And that's just with the expenses. Now, then you start looking at the other key metrics, of course, occupancy being, the biggest. And you want to make sure that your rents are high enough that you know you're making good money, but at the same time you don't want to have, say, like 100% occupancy. People think 100% occupancy is good. I say if you have 100% occupancy, your rates are too low. And so you have to be looking at that, and then looking at how many people are leaving on a monthly basis, because you might be able to offset risk. If you have 18 leases coming due in July, well, that's a huge amount of people that are leaving in 1 month. What are you doing to mitigate that risk? Well, maybe the leases that you're signing up now, you're making them 13-month leases instead of 12-month leases, so that you're covering down on that period. There's all kinds of little tricks that you can do to mitigate those risks. But the point is, if you don't know those risks are there, if you're not aware of them, you can't do anything about them. And you don't want to find out about them after the fact. That in management, asset managers are the ones who make the decisions, right? For all the recommendations of the property manager. In most instances, other than minor stuff, the property managers don't have the ability to make decisions when it comes to, rate changes or to hire people and stuff like that. So that's why, we meet with property management on a weekly basis, where they go over all the key metrics that we've already set out. And then that way we can ask the questions right there and hopefully get anything fixed that we need to. But we never lose the bubble since we're meeting with them so frequently.
Interesting. Okay. So you've just destroyed the entire, lit the misconception on fire. There's probably a significant advantage in being very good at managing that manager. It sounds like that manager of the property is the executor of the strategy that you've laid out and that you've defined, maybe analytically from an occupancy and rate perspective, and then have some understanding about how to manage that property strategically, depending on the markets that you're in, the costs that you're seeing. They're the executor of your strategy. So what's been your biggest discovery in sort of managing those relationships? What was the most surprising thing?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean,
big exhale.
Yeah, because you're right. They are executing it on the day to day. You can't always be there. And so that's why that hiring process for property managers is so important up front. Not just, who do you recommend? Like, no, you usually have to find, the top 2 or 3 within that segment who deal with that asset class, be it B or C. Because if you got someone who's used to dealing with A class and you hire them for a C minus, they may be ill-equipped to deal with the problems that arise at those types of properties. So first, I'd say it's about finding the right representation. But I think the other thing is, like, honestly, if they're not living up to what you felt like each side agreed to, and they're not cooperating with you, what I've seen in some instances is property managers kind of try to take over, right? And they're like, I got this, I'll do it. And like, no, you work for us, remember? And so there's been times when we've had to split ways because there was just irreconcilable differences. And that is painful because of, obviously everything involved that a property manager does. Having to move them out and move someone else in is a painful process, but it's absolutely necessary in some instances, because a good or bad property manager can make or break your deal over the course of that, 3 to 5 year hold.
That's interesting. I was going to ask if you've ever displaced one, and the answer is yes. What was that? What was that like? Share a little bit more about how long until, I guess the biggest question is, how long until you started to see better performance from that new property manager versus the old? How big was that lag period where there probably wasn't great oversight and performance.
Yeah, it's like a couple of weeks, right?
Oh wow, okay.
Because they need at least a week to get their systems in place. Whatever
Mhm.
their property management software, um, etc., and get an understanding of everything that's happening before
Mhm.
those meetings start up again, and they have the numbers to start reporting. Um, but it's relatively quick. But there's still going to be that period in between. Not a whole lot can go wrong, in a couple of weeks, anyways.
Mhm.
But again, you have to give them that time to get settled, to get their systems in place, property management systems, etc.,
Mhm.
and then start reporting to you. And even then, you may have to tweak as you go along. Like, hey, we would like to see this in your reporting. Please add that
Mhm.
in. And they're like, okay. And then the next week, you should see that. So it wasn't as painful as it could be, but it's never pleasant when you have to do it.
Mhm. Yeah, never fun when you got to pull the cord. But yeah, it doesn't sound like it's too bad. I was thinking in terms of months, not weeks. So that beats my initial expectation. Do you ever think about? I'm sure you do think about. What are your views on vertically integrating some of the property managers into the organization, into your organization?
Eh, and how do you mean? Just like having them invested in the deals, or do you mean developing our own property management company and being vertically integrated within ourselves?
Yeah, more of the latter of being
Okay.
having your own or hiring those people into your own sort of property management company.
Yeah, gotcha. No, and it's something that I've thought about and I've certainly seen other people do successfully.
Mhm.
I think the challenge and like the prerequisite is that you're going to have a lot of properties locally to a region for it to make sense.
Mhm.
So if you're geographically dispersed, right, say you got some properties in Texas and some in Georgia, then it's going to be really hard to, kind of organically build that out locally. Um, because property management is usually so regionally focused,
Mhm.
it would just be hard to do that. You'd almost have to build up little mini property management companies
Mhm.
in each location, and it just wouldn't be as natural as what I've seen other people do, where they're like, hey, we focus on Charleston, and that's all we do is Charleston. We own
Mhm.
5 properties in Charleston, so we vertically integrated. Our property management runs all of our 5 properties in Charleston, and that makes 100% sense to me. And I certainly wouldn't be opposed to doing it.
Mhm.
It's just the way we've grown and where our assets are located. It doesn't really seem to make sense right now.
Yeah, it sounds like you don't want sort of the property management tail to wag the asset acquisition dog in a sense, right? You're not going to have, it doesn't make sense for you to vertically integrate in 3 different states until you reach some
Yeah.
critical mass to get there. Plus, it sounds like if you have a great process to work with a local property manager, you can probably feel the gains of that vertical integration through your process and the willingness to find the people to execute against it. Would there be much gain then in vertically integrating at all? Because I think it's a control game that you're really trying to get to, right? Where you feel like you've got your hands on the wheel all the time. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
exactly. Because you're putting a lot of trust into those property managers where you're not physically located,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, they do have the regional expertise. They know rents and everything else, block to block, because they're probably managing, multiple properties in that area. So they can kind of use their own scale and regional expertise as your advantage. And then also from the hiring perspective, for staff, that's an advantage as well because they're able to hire locally. They can maybe flex staff from one property to another in order to support where needed. So again, while it's not ideal and you are putting some trust, into someone who's distanced, you're still getting a lot of other benefits from them being so hyper local.
100%. So what does the future hold? What's the I'm asking an interview question. What's the next 5-10 years hold for you and for the ambitions that you have for the firm?
Yeah, and so I think I continue to like multifamily. It doesn't mean that I'm not casting an eye at other assets that I also find attractive. Being here in Florida, short-term rentals are another hot one. There's obviously a ton of pros and cons associated with that, but I mean, you can seriously kill it on some short-term rentals if you're doing it right. And then if you start building out those systems and that scale and everything else. So that's something I'm looking at. And then, I'm hearing a lot of talk about mobile home parks lately. That is also big in the Southeast in general, and not something I'm opposed to. So again, exploring other assets, but continuing to focus on multifamily, which is our bread and butter. Growing out the investor base, so that we can help more people kind of, escape that landlord trap, as I call it. For example, so many, veterans like myself spent 20 years in the military, and then during that time they moved from place to place, picking up a single family house everywhere they went, not because they were, real estate moguls, but because they just happen to have it, and they're like, why not rent it out rather than, sell it? And so now these folks have 2 or 3 properties that maybe they're making decent cash flow on, maybe they're not, but it's just starting to become more of a burden for them because they're dealing with this property management company 5 states away who's taking 10%, and the water heater just went out, there's $10,000, whatever the case is. And so as they're getting a little older, they're looking to transition into something a little more passive. And that's where I can help them out to say, hey, I can give you the benefits of real estate, but in a much more passive way. And so, helping them to see the advantages of passive investing. They still get depreciation. They still might get some cash flow, but they're definitely going to get, appreciation on the back end, stuff like that. So helping to educate as many people as we can about those benefits, and then helping people to realize that they have more money than they know, whether that's, in their individual retirement accounts or, even in their own bank accounts. So that's what we're looking at right now, just to educate as many investors as possible, grow our investor base, so that we can continue to purchase property and help people seek, passive investing freedom.
2 responses to that. It's awesome. 2 responses to that. One, I'm glad. Here's 2 terms that I think we're starting to coin. We'll see how much legs they have. One, I'm glad to hear that it's great to have experience and depth and understanding of an asset class. And you guys definitely have it in multifamily, but you're not a zealot for it. And so we've been using this term asset class zealot a lot. When we hear, just put a blindfold on and keep buying asset class, whatever it is, I don't care what it is. But at some point, there's a point in which you look at the metrics, the numbers, the return patterns, and you go, this doesn't make sense. And so it's good that you have eyes wide open, that you need to kind of potentially look at other asset classes. And then 2, you bring up a really great point about some of our military based friends. We've coined a term for them too: accidental real estate investors. Like, oh my gosh, they wake up and like, oh, well, I didn't plan this. How did this happen? Why is this happening? Oh, wait, this is getting painful. I don't like this. Yeah, the accidental. So we're pretty good at as well. And it's kind of a subset of our clients. So we're helping them transition out of those properties and get passive and defer tax there. Seems to be a growing segment of our business. And it's very tough for them, we think, because they're just not as plugged into all the things they can do from a real estate perspective, because they're not real estate investors. They haven't plugged themselves into this world or environment, so they just don't know. So it's a great thing that you have your eyes on them as well. So this is awesome. Tim, anything else that you want to share or leave with our listeners?
Sure. I would just say, if they want to get a hold of me, you can reach me at tim@zanainvestments.com. Of course, you can go to the website, ZanaInvestments.com. And then I'd like to offer your folks, free passive investor cheat sheet. Remember, we talked about how confusing all this jargon and terminology can be. I mean, at least it was for me anyways, when I first came into it. So I did up a little cheat sheet. It's basically the top 33 terms that you need to understand to be a confident passive investor. So they can go to ZanaInvestments.com/cheat sheet to get that for free. And then finally, a quick plug for Journey to Multifamily Millions, a little podcast that I have where I just did my 50th episode, and you can find amazing guests like Brandon Bruckman.
Awesome. Yeah, that's an awesome plug. Thank you for offering that to our folks as well. We'll link all that up to the show notes so people can track all that down. Tim, this has been awesome. Thank you for having me first on your podcast and then joining us on ours. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a pleasure on both sides. Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.